Freedomland, USA, 205 acres of northeast Bronx marshland, shaped like the continental United States. $65 million to build. The New York Times observed at the time that this was enough to produce 22 movie spectaculars, or 130 hour-long television specials. 85 acres of themed attractions, 8 miles of navigable waterways, 2 400-passenger stern-wheel riverboats, 200 horses, 80 burros, 6 stagecoaches, and an actual herd of Texas Longhorns. Chicago burning to the ground every 20 minutes. Bigger than Disneyland, the self-proclaimed Disneyland of the East. Bigger than any amusement park in the world when it opened on Father's Day, 1960, the largest theme park ever built. 61,500 people walked through the gates on opening day. Ed Sullivan broadcast his show from inside the park, calling it Disneyland's equal. It lasted 5 seasons. Then the bulldozers came. What stands on the site today is a shopping mall, 15,000 apartments in 35 high-rise towers, and a plaque bolted to a rock in a grassy strip on Bartow Avenue. That is the entire physical record of the world's largest amusement park. This is the story of how one real estate deal, arranged in the spring of 1964, while the park was still open, killed America's largest amusement park, and why one of the men who made that deal later admitted in print that the park had never been meant to last. Before Freedomland, before Co-op City, before any of it, there was 400 acres of tidal marsh in the Baychester section of the northeast Bronx, fed by the Hutchinson River and by a stream then called Rattlesnake Creek. It had been a municipal landfill. It bred mosquitoes. In 1927, a federal commerce secretary named Herbert Hoover, along with a Bronx official named Major William Deegan, had proposed building an airport there. Runways on the land, seaplane docks on the water. In the 1930s, someone floated a racetrack. Neither plan happened. The marsh stayed a marsh. In 1949, a real estate developer named William Zeckendorf acquired a company called Webb and Knapp, and Webb and Knapp acquired the Baychester Marsh. Zeckendorf was, at that moment, the most flamboyant real estate operator in New York. Within a decade, he would control nearly $300 million in assets, 20,000 apartments, 10 million square feet of office space, the largest shopping mall in America at Roosevelt Field, and for a brief interval, the Chrysler Building. He employed a young architect named I.M. Pei as his in-house designer. He built Place Ville Marie in Montreal, Society Hill Towers in Philadelphia, L'Enfant Plaza in Washington, and Century City in Los Angeles. The scale of what he did is worth naming, because when he lost at the same scale. In 1968, his personal bankruptcy filing would list $79 million in liabilities against $1,885,000 in assets. But that was later. In 1959, Zeckendorf owned a marsh, and he needed something to do with it. What he did with it came from a Texan named Cornelius Vanderbilt Wood, Jr. Everybody called him Woody. In 1953, he had been a young engineer at the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California, running the feasibility study for a project Walt Disney was calling Disneyland. The following year, the Disney brothers hired him as Disneyland's first employee. He selected the site in Anaheim. He purchased the land. He directed construction, financing, and the park's first year of operation. Walt Disney is said to have referred to him as a son. Then, in the first weeks of 1956, Roy Disney fired him after a heated argument, and the Disney Company began the process of erasing his name from its official history. Wood formed his own company. He called it Marco Engineering. He started calling himself the master planner of Disneyland until a Disney lawsuit made him stop. He built a park called Magic Mountain outside Denver, which failed. He built a park called Pleasure Island outside Boston, which failed. He built Six Flags Over Texas in Arlington, which did not fail. Then he pitched Zeckendorf on an American history theme park for the Baychester Marsh, and Zeckendorf, who needed something to do with the marsh, said yes. Wood assembled about 200 artists and architects. Many were former Disney employees. Others came out of the Hollywood film industry, out of Broadway, out of network television. To handle radio and television coverage of the park, Wood's people hired Sylvester Weaver Jr., the former president of NBC who had invented The Today Show and The Tonight Show. For the lighting, they hired Douglas Lee, the man responsible for the giant smoke ring Camel cigarette billboard that hung over Times Square, whose name had become synonymous with large-scale spectacle lighting in mid-century New York. To handle advertising, they hired Ellington & Co. To handle the burros and the herd, they bought 200 horses, 80 burros, 6 stagecoaches, canoes, saddles, and a herd of longhorn steers. For the dark rides, they contracted Aero Development, a California fabrication company that had already built attractions for Disneyland and would go on to define the modern roller coaster. Aero built 4 of Freedomland's dark rides. The idea was that from a bird's-eye view, the finished park would resemble a small-scale map of the continental United States, buffered by 120 acres of parking lot. Guests would enter at Little Old New York, in the Northeast, and move west through Old Chicago, where a 10-acre artificial lake held 10 million gallons of water and stood in for the Great Lakes. Then south through the Great Plains, west to San Francisco, and back north through the Old Southwest and New Orleans. At the southeast corner stood Satellite City, a space-age zone with a mock Cape Canaveral control room, a spaceship theater built by Braniff Airways, and a moving sidewalk that crossed a man-made lake. Baychester Avenue, along the western edge, was to be the border with Canada. The scale of the physical undertaking was, at the time, without precedent. 2,000 construction workers under Turner Construction and Aberthaw Construction. 10 acres of land excavated to create the canals. Land raised by as much as 50 feet in places to build up the artificial topography. 42 buildings under construction by February 1960. 10,000 newly planted trees, 35,000 shrubs, a working bank branch sponsored by the Bank of New York, a Macy's outlet built as a replica of the original Herald Square store, a brewery sponsored by Schaefer Beer, a Chinese restaurant sponsored by Chun King, an A&W root beer stand. More than 80 commercial tenants would eventually fund the construction of their own attractions. When it was announced, the park was to cost $15.5 million. When it opened, the tally was $65 million. On opening day, Freedomland was already $7 million in debt. A New York Times preview in June 1960 reported that the buildings had been built to last 50 years. Hold on to that number. It matters later. The park's slogan was, "The world's newest and largest outdoor entertainment center." Ellington & Co. commissioned a jingle. It went, "Mommy, Daddy, take my hand, take me out to Freedomland. 50 cents is all you pay at Freedomland today." A generation of New Yorkers would still be able to sing it half a century later. The refrain about 50 cents was replaced within one season, then replaced again, then replaced again. The price kept climbing up, up, up. The dedication ceremony was held on Saturday, June 18, 1960, in front of the Chicago-themed railroad station. 25,000 people attended. Mayor Robert Wagner was there. Senator Jacob Javits, Senator Kenneth Keating. Wagner delivered a speech from the archives of the LaGuardia and Wagner collection. "Our millions of residents," he said, "and the additional millions of visitors are living proof of the democracy and freedom enjoyed in our land, which is symbolized by the Statue of Liberty guarding our harbor." He said the creators of Freedomland had chosen wisely in selecting New York City. That evening, Ed Sullivan broadcast his television show from the park. Sunday morning, June 19th, Father's Day. The line of cars on the New England Thruway begins to form 2.5 hours before the 8:30 ribbon cutting. Pat Boone cuts the ribbon. The gates open at 9. By noon, the parking lot is full. Radio announcers begin telling listeners not to come. The roads are jammed. The lots are overfilled. The Hutchinson River Parkway is at a standstill. At 2:05 in the afternoon, Freedomland stops selling tickets. 61,500 people are on the grounds. As many as 40,000 of them are inside the park at one time. The park closes at 9 that night, 3 hours ahead of schedule. Underneath the crowds and the ribbons, something else is true. Freedomland is only 85% complete. Satellite City is not operational. The electrical work is unfinished. The Chicago Fire attraction, which will become the park's signature spectacle, is not operational either. A security guard tells a reporter that the drinking fountains do not work. The restrooms are few and far between. Many of the concessionaires are not yet fully equipped. Some of the exhibits have not been painted. The New York Times had noted in an April preview article that the finished park would be an animated history book in which cowboys will soon fret, stagecoaches will be robbed, and Chicago will burn every 20 minutes. Chicago, on opening day, was not burning. By Monday, attendance dropped to 15,000. About a month later, a stagecoach overturned in the Great Plains section, injuring 10 people. 3 were hospitalized. One of them, according to the record, had a snapped spine. The park initially denied responsibility until a visitor released a photograph. On August 28, 4 armed men, later identified as employees, stole the day's receipts, $28,836, and escaped from the park by boat. They were caught 2 weeks later. In August, the co-founders, C.V. Wood and Milton Ted Rayner, both resigned. In November, Turner and Aberthaw filed a mechanics lien against the park for $3.5 million in unpaid construction bills. By season's end, the park had drawn 1.5 million visitors. It had needed 2 million just to break even. The initial projection had been 5 million. The stock had opened at $17.50 a share. By year's end, it was trading at 6.25. Go back 3 months. March 24, 1960. Nearly 90 days before Freedomland is scheduled to open, 6 unfinished buildings on the construction site catch fire and are destroyed. Turner and Aberthaw haul the wreckage away, or rather, they haul most of it away. Some of the charred lumber, some of the smoke-blackened studs, some of the half-collapsed framing is loaded up and moved across the site to what is being built as Old Chicago. There it is used as props for the reenacted Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The signature attraction of the world's largest amusement park is dressed with the wreckage of a real fire that had happened 3 months earlier on the same construction site. Tom Casey of the East Bronx History Forum, who as a child had been one of Freedomland's guests, would later observe in an interview, "There was a couple of fires before Freedomland even opened, and they took up some of the debris and put it in Old Chicago for the Chicago Fire exhibit. They didn't waste too much money there. The Chicago Fire itself, once operational, worked like this. A wooden building was rigged with individual gas jets. At scheduled times, every 15 minutes, or every 20, depending on the source, the jets would ignite and the building would burn. Children were enlisted to man the fire hoses and pump water into a bucket brigade to help extinguish the flames. In 1960, no one thought to write down what the insurance policy said about this. By the end of the first season, this was the mood of the whole enterprise. 25,000 people at the dedication. 61,000 on opening day. Then a slow leak, small crowds, payroll cuts, an August robbery by the park's own employees, a stagecoach that flipped over, a promotional history book that could not be finished on schedule, propped up with the timbers of a fire that had happened before the gates ever opened. Zeckendorf spent 1961 trying to save it. He replaced Wood and Rayner with a marketing man named Art Moss. Moss cut the weekly payroll by 20% from $150,000 a week. He forbade overtime. To reverse the park's collapsing reputation among New Yorkers who had heard about the opening day traffic jam and the shortage of drinking water, he opened the gates free to New York City taxi drivers and their families. When Freedomland's contractors filed their lien, Zeckendorf's parent company, Webb and Knapp, injected $3 million in cash into Freedomland and purchased the lien itself. Zeckendorf proposed swapping the leaseholds on 3 Midtown Manhattan hotels, the Astor, the Commodore, and the Manhattan, to the International Recreation Corporation, the Boston Incorporated parent of the operating company, in exchange for a $16 million mortgage note. The proposal was approved. The second season opened on June 10, 1961. Pay per ride was abolished. A single park-wide admission of $2.95 replaced the old sliding scale. To fill the hours that history alone was not filling, Freedomland began booking musicians. A 15,000-square-foot dance floor called the Moon Bowl was installed. Louis Armstrong played there, so did Nat King Cole, Duke Ellington, Tony Bennett, Bobby Darin, Count Basie. Chubby Checker headlined the opening of the fourth season in 1963. The 1963 talent budget was $1,200,000. For one season, it seemed to be working. In 1961, the park drew 1.7 million visitors, the highest attendance of any Freedomland season ever. Visitors stayed for an average of 7 hours and 48 minutes. Then it started to unravel again. In September 1962, Benjamin Moore and Company, the paint manufacturer that had funded an exhibit in Satellite City, sued Freedomland for $150,000. The company argued in court that the park had abandoned its historical and educational character in favor of what one Times report characterized as commonplace and vulgar mass, unrestrained teenage entertainment. The suit was dismissed. The rift was public. Off-season maintenance alone was now costing $1 million a year. Concessionaires began to complain of rents that had climbed to $20 and $25 a square foot, which they could not cover on their thin margins. In the middle of the 1962 season, 700 of the park's 3,000 workers were laid off. Total, 1962 admissions came to roughly 1.4 million. Something else was happening at the same time, in a different part of Zeckendorf's world. It would matter more than any of this. Webb and Knapp was dying. The company that had once owned the Chrysler Building and financed the largest shopping mall in America posted an operating loss of $19,600,000 in 1962. In 1963, the loss was $32,300,000. Freedomland's 1963 season opened on April 21. Admission was cut back to $1. Historical themes had by then been almost fully replaced with midway rides, puppet shows, disc jockey appearances, and circus parades. In July, Zeckendorf tried to auction off the plot of land that had been reserved for the never-built Freedomland Inn, 500,000 square feet, at a minimum asking price of $2 million. There were no bids. He began selling off adjacent plots piecemeal. By the end of 1963, Webb and Knapp had written off its entire $17,900,000 investment in Freedomland. In December 1963, 3 weeks after President Kennedy was shot in Dallas, Zeckendorf secured a $25 million mortgage loan from the pension fund of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. He put up the lease on Freedomland's 149-acre site as collateral. This was money borrowed against the ground the amusement park sat on, from the same pension fund that federal investigators would eventually be examining in connection with Jimmy Hoffa. In 1962 and 1963 combined, Freedomland had earned a total of $3 million in admissions. The Teamsters' loan against its land was for 8 times that. By early 1964, the pattern had become clear inside Webb and Knapp. The park could not be saved, but something else had come into view. Something more valuable than what any ticket booth could produce. In May of 1964, an 80-year-old man in New York City, recently pushed out of most of the public offices he had held, no longer the force he had been for 4 decades, arranged a meeting on behalf of a non-profit housing developer. His name was Robert Moses. Moses had been, until recently, the most powerful unelected figure in the history of the city. He had built the highways, the parkways, the parks, the beaches, the housing projects, many of them funded through Title I Urban Renewal, the federal program that gave city planners the authority to condemn land, displace existing residents, and redevelop at scale. By 1964, he had lost most of it: the Slum Clearance Committee, the City Construction Coordinator's Office, the chairmanship of the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, What he still had was one last major job. He was the president of the 1964-1965 New York World's Fair in Queens, which had opened on April 22, and which would shortly become the reason Freedomland's bankruptcy lawyers cited for the park's collapse. While Moses was running that fair, while Freedomland's operators were preparing to blame that fair for their coming failure, Moses privately informed Abraham Kazan of the United Housing Foundation, a nonprofit cooperative housing developer with close ties to labor unions, that William Zeckendorf was eager to sell a large parcel of Bronx land. Half of that parcel was the site of an amusement park that had not yet closed for the season. The following month, June of 1964, Zeckendorf approached the United Housing Foundation directly and offered to sell them 415 acres, including the entire Freedomland site, plus the adjoining marsh, for a residential development. Freedomland was still operating. Its fifth season was underway. This is the deal. This is what killed Freedomland. Not the World's Fair, not the Kennedy assassination, not teenage tastes, not the weather. The reveal comes in Zeckendorf's own words. 6 years later, in 1970, he published his autobiography. In it, he described his involvement with Freedomland this way. "We got into Freedomland the way the United States got into Vietnam, back sideways, without really intending to, and only to clean up the mess somebody else had left behind." In the same book, according to historians who have read it, Zeckendorf described Freedomland flatly as a placeholder. Its function was to obtain zoning variances and to prove that the marshy Bronx shoreline could support the weight of high-rise residential construction, thereby bypassing the 15 to 20-year monitoring period that a new development on this kind of ground would normally have required. The historian Michael Vergentino, who wrote the definitive book-length account of the park in 2019, put it more bluntly. Co-op City, he said, was on New York City's blueprints before the first shovel of dirt was turned to build the park. Freedomland, U.S.A. was doomed to fail before the first guest entered the park. Their goal, Vergentino said, was always, let's use the land as we can now until a better opportunity comes along. Freedomland was doomed from the start. The world's largest amusement park was a soil test. Once the deal was set in motion, everything else happened on a schedule. The 1964 season had opened on May 16th, with the San Francisco-themed area already walled off from the public. Rumors circulated inside the park that Freedomland was going to be moved to Florida, where it could operate year-round. Staff were told privately that only Little Old New York, Old Chicago, and Satellite City might be reopened for 1965, while the rest of the park would be redeveloped. On July 1, the International Recreation Corporation acquired Webb and Knapp's stake in Freedomland Incorporated. The president of the National Development Corporation, Hyman Green, bought Zeckendorf's remaining 80% interest in that subsidiary and publicly predicted Freedomland will turn a profit in 1964. In 1964, Freedomland earned $738,000 in total admissions. It paid its employees $60,000 in checks that could not be cashed. On September 13, 1964, Freedomland closed for the season. Within 3 days, Freedomland Incorporated filed for bankruptcy. Its liabilities were $27 million. Its assets were $9 million. The largest creditors, in order, were the International Recreation Corporation, the National Development Corporation, William Zeckendorf personally, and the Internal Revenue Service. The bankruptcy filing, according to later accounts, nearly caused the collapse of the Teamsters Union pension fund that held the $25 million mortgage. Walt Disney had said, 3 years earlier of the whole enterprise, "I think it was wrong from the start." Through 1965, the attractions were auctioned off. The San Francisco Earthquake Dark Ride, one of 4 aero development built for the park, went to Cedar Point in Ohio. The Buccaneers Pirate Ride went with it. The Crystal Maze, Danny the Dragon, the Tornado Dark Ride, and the King Rex Carousel went to Storytown, U.S.A. on Lake George, the park that would eventually become Six Flags Great Escape. Two of the three Santa Fe Railroad stations went to Clark's Trading Post in Lincoln, New Hampshire, along with bricks salvaged from little old New York, seats from the Braniff space rover, and street lamps from all over the park. One of the two sternwheelers ended up in the Byram River between Greenwich, Connecticut, and Port Chester, New York, where it served for a time as a restaurant before being destroyed. Totsy the tugboat went to Quasi Amusement Park in Middlebury, Connecticut. The land underneath, all of it, passed through the teamsters, who by this point had little use for a parcel of Bronx swampland and were, in the language of one later historian, desperate to find a buyer, and into the hands of the United Housing Foundation, which is what Zeckendorf and Moses had privately arranged 18 months earlier. Marine Midland Trust filed to reorganize Webb and Knapp in May of 1965. A court-appointed trustee took control on May 18th. 3 years later, Zeckendorf himself filed for personal bankruptcy, $79 million in liabilities against $1,885,000 in assets. By early 1966, most of what still stood at Freedomland was gone. On May 14, 1966, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Robert Moses, Abraham Kazan, and the president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, Jacob Potofsky, gathered at the northeast corner of the Bronx marshland to break ground on a housing development. Rockefeller called it a completely sound investment in a better society. The former president of the United Housing Foundation handed Kazan the ceremonial engraved shovel. The development would be called Co-op City. It was designed by an architect named Herman Jessor, whose firm had already produced affordable housing towers across the outer boroughs under the Mitchell-Lama program. Co-op City would rise on Freedomland's parking lot and on the former sites of Little Old New York and Satellite City. The construction contractors would spread more than 200 million tons of earth, sand, and gravel across the marsh as landfill to bear the weight of what was coming. 35 high-rise buildings, 10 24-story chevrons, 10 26-story triple cores, 15 33-story towers, 338 feet tall, briefly the tallest buildings in the Bronx, 15,372 apartments, 7 clusters of 236 townhouses, its own shopping centers, its own weekly newspaper, its own power plant, its own schools, its own planetarium. The initial mortgage was $235 million, financed under the New York State Mitchell-Lama program, which had been created in 1955 to build affordable housing for working and middle-class families who earned too much to qualify for public housing but too little to afford the private market. By the time construction concluded in 1972, cost overruns had ballooned the mortgage to $390 million. The rest is the epilogue. Residents had been promised carrying charges of $22 a room. By 1975, after successive state-mandated hikes, the state was asking for $53.50 a room, a 250% increase. About 80% of Co-op City's residents withheld their carrying charges. The strike lasted 13 months, from June 1975 to July 1976. It was the largest rent strike in American history. It nearly bankrupted the New York State Housing Finance Agency. It was mediated to a conclusion by the Bronx Borough President, Robert Abrams, and by a state official named Mario Cuomo, who would later become governor, and whose son Andrew would visit the complex in a campaign video half a century after that. In exchange for $20 million in back payments, the residents took over management of the complex. Co-op City today has somewhere between 40 and 60,000 residents, depending on which census tabulation you consult. It is majority black. It represents roughly 15% of all the apartments built in New York City under the entire 20-year lifespan of the Mitchell-Lama program. In April 2020, Co-op City's board and the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development signed an agreement to keep the 16,000 apartments there price-limited and income-restricted through the year 2052. The New York Times, in June of 1960, had reported that Freedomland's buildings were built to last 50 years. They lasted 6. The buildings that replaced them are on year 60 and counting, and are contractually committed to still standing there, still affordable, in the year 2052. Walk today to 2035 Bartow Avenue in the Bronx, in a grassy strip near the mall entrance in Co-op City. There is a rock. Bolted to the rock is a plaque dedicated on August 17, 2013, by the East Bronx History Forum and by a historian named Michael Vergentino. Placed on the grass next to the rock in July of 2019 are the decorative paddle wheels and the smokestack from Tootsie, one of the 2 harbor tugs that had once carried children around the imitation waters of little old New York. Those are the only physical traces of Freedomland, U.S.A. on the site where Freedomland, U.S.A. stood. To the east, the Bay Plaza Shopping Center opened in 1988, on the ground where the Great Plains and the Old Southwest had been. In 2012, an enclosed fashion mall was added to Bay Plaza, the last piece of the original 400 acres to be developed, 48 years after Freedomland closed. That last plot had been zoned from 1960 onward for a 600-room hotel called the Freedomland Inn, which was never built. The concrete foundation slab of the Freedomland Inn had been used at one point as landfill for the discarded props of the amusement park. To the west, on the parking lot Zeckendorf had paved for the amusement park, stand the 35 towers of Co-op City. Some of the marshland has silted back in. The salt marsh along the Hutchinson River is smaller and more degraded than it was in 1959. The mosquitoes are still there. At the northeast corner of Bartow Avenue and Baychester Avenue, one small parcel of the original Freedomland site remains legally zoned C7, a designation, on the New York City books, that is reserved for large open amusement parks. It is the only C7 lot in the city outside Coney Island, a holdover from a park that has been gone since 1965, an 85-acre map of America built on top of a Bronx swamp in order to prove that the swamp could hold something heavier. The swamp held.